Serial killer family. The Bloody Mill Murders of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, 1708. In the autumn of 1708, 38 travelers vanished along a 15-mile stretch of the Schuylkill Road near Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Each one disappeared without a trace. They left behind only abandoned wagons and scattered luggage, things that offered no clues to their fate. What made these disappearances truly chilling was not just the number of victims, but the fact that local authorities seemingly went to great lengths to conceal all records of the subsequent investigation. For over 2 centuries, the truth of the Whitaker family's mill remained hidden in sealed court documents until a historian discovered them in the city archives in 1989, revealing the most horrific mass murder case of America's early colonial period. The documents described a sophisticated killing operation perfectly disguised under a veneer of hospitality and Quaker piety, an operation that had operated for 7 years without detection. Before we continue the story of the mill that became Philadelphia's first house of horrors, make sure you subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We are about to uncover the secrets that powerful families tried to bury forever. And let us know in the comments what state you're listening from. The story of the Whitaker family didn't begin with screams in the night. It began with a simple act: rearranging old documents. In a dusty Philadelphia city archive in 1708, the area along the Schuylkill River near Philadelphia was a land caught between colonial civilization and untamed wilderness, a place where the dream of prosperity attracted hundreds of travelers from the seaports and the interior. The Schuylkill Road, a bustling trade route that ran alongside the river, was the main artery connecting Philadelphia to the western settlements. This narrow, muddy road stretched for over 100 miles through dense forests and treacherous cliffs, a place where a small mistake could lead to death by storm, wild animals, or bandits lurking in the shadows. Along this dangerous route, small communities had sprung up like oases of hope for families seeking a new life. In the colonial territory, these settlements served as essential stopovers where exhausted travelers could rest, replenish their supplies, and gather news about the dangers that lay ahead. The existence and growth of these communities often depended on their ability to provide a safe haven for the constant stream of migrants and merchants passing through their territory. The town of Germantown was strategically located along the Schuylkill Road, where the trail cut through dense forests to enter the fertile land. Along the Schuylkill River, near Philadelphia, with fewer than 400 residents, it was a place where everyone knew each other, or at least they thought they did. The town, founded in 1699 by a group of Quakers from England seeking religious freedom, their influence was deeply embedded in every aspect of community life. Sunday prayer meetings, mandatory for all residents, and the town council enforced strict moral codes regulating everything from alcohol consumption to social gatherings. The heart of the settlement was Whitmore's General Store, a sturdy stone building that served as both a trading post and an informal place for settling disputes. Isaac Whitmore, a stern former sailor who had weathered Atlantic storms, ran the store with a firm hand and a sharp business sense. His store provided everything a traveler might need: flour, rope, rum, woolen blankets, and the latest news from the bustling ports of Philadelphia. Not far away was the River's Rest Inn, a 2-story timber structure, a symbol of colonial comfort. Sarah Bolton, the widow who ran the inn, had arrived from London 6 years earlier, with enough capital to build the most luxurious resting place between Philadelphia and Lancaster, travelers could find a hot meal and a clean bed for 3 pence a night, along with stories of the civilized world they had left behind. The spiritual center of the town was the Schuylkill Quaker Meeting House, a simple wooden building that could hold the entire population for Sunday prayers. Reverend William Pennock, a self-taught scholar who had abandoned city life in Boston to preach in the new land, delivered sermons that blended Quaker doctrine with practical advice for survival in the harsh territory. His presence gave Germantown an air of respectability, attracting travelers and settlers who might have otherwise just passed through. Among the most respected residents of Germantown were the Whitaker family, Samuel, his wife, Hannah, and their 3 adult children, 2 sons, Ezra and Levi, and a daughter, Esther. The family arrived in the spring of 1701, claiming to be survivors of a horrific wildfire, a fire that had destroyed their previous home in Virginia. They quickly became pillars of the small community, Samuel assisting as a lay preacher during Quaker meetings, and Hannah organizing charitable activities, providing food and clothing to the poor travelers who came through. Samuel Whitaker was a man who commanded respect by his very presence. Tall, with thick black hair and sharp, piercing eyes, he possessed a powerful demeanor, a demeanor that made others automatically make way for him. His deep, resonant voice could fill the meeting house without effort, delivering sermons that moved listeners with passionate descriptions of God's mercy and stern warnings of final judgment. Those who heard him preach often said he seemed to speak with the authority of someone who had faced both heaven and hell directly. Hannah Whitaker was equally remarkable in her own way. A petite woman with keen eyes and ever-busy hands, she had become the community's unofficial healer. Her knowledge of herbs and folk remedies was as extensive as a medical textbook, and she could treat everything from fevers to serious wounds with almost miraculous skill. Many families were indebted to her for late-night visits during critical times, and her reputation for medical talent spread throughout the Philadelphia region. Their children seemed to be paragons of colonial virtue. Ezra, the eldest son, at 27, inherited his father's tall build and his mother's gentle nature. He operated the family mill with relentless dedication, while also helping neighbors with repairs to their wagons or tools. Levi, 24, was slighter in build, but had a sharp mind, often teaching math and letters to the town's children. During the winter months, when work at the mill slowed, at 21, Esther was considered one of the most charming young women in the region, with a sweet singing voice and an amiable personality that endeared her to men and women alike. The Whitaker Mill stood on 300 acres of fertile land along the Schuylkill River, 2 miles west of Germantown. The land had cost Samuel nearly his entire fortune, but the investment proved wise. The fertile soil produced abundant wheat and barley, while the river provided power for the massive millstone, a millstone which served the entire surrounding area. Visiting travelers often marveled at the mill's unusual prosperity, noting that the Whitakers possessed more wealth, from finely carved furniture to strange decorative glass jars, than a typical milling operation could account for. Samuel Whitaker had built his establishment with meticulous attention to both comfort and security. The main mill, a 2-story stone structure with a large fireplace and glass windows imported from England, a rare luxury. In the colonies, The rooms were decorated with items far too refined for a family running a simple mill: carved tables and chairs, ceramic dishes imported from Holland, strange glass jars containing unidentified specimens, and Quaker religious texts that suggested a level of education and sophistication. A large barn could hold 40 horse-drawn wagons. A system of outbuildings included a smokehouse, a butter churnery, a Wainwright's shop, and what Samuel called the largest flour cellar in the region. What made the Whitaker family particularly valuable to the Germantown community was their willingness to assist travelers in distress. The land along the Schuylkill River was harsh for those who traveled alone or unprepared, and rarely a week went by without someone arriving at the mill seeking help. On more than one occasion, Samuel had personally ventured out in storms to assist with an overturned wagon or a lame horse, often inviting the stranded travelers to stay at the mill until repairs were made. Such hospitality was considered a Quaker duty in the colonies, but the Whitakers elevated it to an extraordinary level. Hannah was especially known for her willingness to treat sick or injured travelers, regardless of their ability to pay. Her medical skills, a combination of herbalism and folk methods, had saved many lives, and numerous travelers were able to continue their journey only thanks to her intervention. She maintained a small but well-equipped infirmary in one of the outbuildings, with jars of tinctures and surgical knives that even doctors in Philadelphia would have coveted. The family's reputation for hospitality spread so widely that, by 1708, travelers often deliberately sought out the Whitaker Mill when planning their journeys. Local guides would frequently direct groups toward the Schuylkill River, assuring them that the Whitakers would provide affordable provisions and a safe place to spend the night. The family's guest book, meticulously kept by Esther, with detailed entries, recorded hundreds of visitors. Over the years, merchants, missionaries, settling families, and solitary wanderers who found shelter at this prosperous mill. But in the brutal reality of colonial life, where death lurked around every bend and trust could be fatal, appearances were not just deceiving. They could be a deadly blade. The first sign that something was terribly wrong came on the 10th of October, 1708, when a fur trapper named Benjamin Clark failed to arrive in Lancaster. As scheduled, Benjamin Clark was no ordinary traveler. He was one of the most seasoned and reliable fur trappers on the Schuylkill Road, a man whose punctuality had brought him wealth, in a world where timing could mean the difference between great profit and severe loss. For 10 years, he had made the dangerous trip between Philadelphia and Lancaster 3 times a year, carrying precious furs east and hunting tools west. Clark's cousin and business partner, Nathaniel Stone, had traveled with him long enough to know his habits. Clark never deviated from his schedule without sending word ahead, and he always avoided unnecessary risks that could jeopardize his valuable cargo. When Stone received no word, after 6 days, 3 days past Clark's promised arrival, he knew a disaster had occurred. Stone's search began at dawn on the 16th of October, retracing Clark's familiar route. From Lancaster, he questioned innkeepers, merchants, and farmers along the way, each confirming that Clark had passed through on schedule. The trail remained clear until Stone reached the area near Germantown, where Clark seemed to have vanished into thin air. The discovery of Clark's wagon came at midday. On the second day of the search, the distinctive wagon, with its red-painted wheels, was found abandoned near a small tributary of the Schuylkill River, still full of cargo, but with no signs of struggle or panic. The horses looked well fed, and cared for, as if they had been intentionally set free, rather than abandoned in chaos. Most puzzlingly, the horse's harness had been unbuckled and hung neatly on a nearby tree branch, an act that suggested calculated human intervention rather than a random accident. Clark's wagon, still intact, filled with valuable furs, and a tin box containing nearly 30 silver shillings, a small fortune after a hard season of trapping. The presence of the cargo all but ruled out a common robbery, the most frequent explanation for dangers on colonial roads. Even more disturbingly, a few of Clark's personal items, a broken clay pipe, a torn piece of fabric from his coat, were scattered in a deliberate line, leading from the main road toward the Whitaker Mill, as if he had been dragged away forcefully. The local sheriff, Thomas Reed, was a man well equipped to investigate such mysteries, a former sailor who had faced pirates and fierce storms on the Atlantic. Reed possessed both sharp investigative skills and the grit necessary to enforce the law. In a rapidly growing city, he had seen enough deception and violence in the port cities to know that the simplest explanations often hid the most complex truths, and Clark's disappearance struck him as deeply unsettling. After receiving the report from Nathaniel Stone, Reed quickly assembled a small but reliable militia for an investigation he knew would be difficult and potentially dangerous. His group included Nathaniel Stone, with his combat experience and sharp tracking skills, and 2 veterans of the Indian Wars. They were not just law enforcers, but men who understood the darkness that could hide even in the most seemingly civilized places. What they discovered during their initial investigation defied all rational explanation. Clark's trail led directly to the Whitaker Mill, marked by unusual mud tracks and a few stray bits of fur. The signs indicated that the trapper had been alive, but possibly dazed, as he was pulled from the road, perhaps trying to resist his captors who were forcing him onto the mill property. But right at the stone threshold of the main house, all traces of Clark's presence suddenly vanished. Reed's team spent hours examining the surrounding area, searching for any sign that might reveal the trapper's fate. They found nothing, no disturbed earth, no signs of a struggle, no bloodstains. It was as if Benjamin Clark had been swallowed by the mill itself and had dissolved into thin air. Even Nathaniel Stone, with his keen eye for tracking, had to admit defeat in the face of the scene's eerie cleanliness. When Sheriff Reed questioned Samuel Whitaker about the missing trapper, the mill owner's response was both cooperative and strangely well rehearsed. Yes, Clark had stopped at the mill the previous evening, arriving just before sunset to ask for some flour. Samuel had warned him about the bandits who frequented the Schuylkill Road at night, especially when he was carrying so much valuable cargo. But Clark had insisted on continuing his journey to Lancaster. The trapper had seemed polite, but rather gruff, refusing Hannah's offer of dinner and a place to stay overnight in order to make good time. According to Samuel, Clark appeared tired and a bit on edge, constantly complaining about the dangers of the roads. When pressed further, Samuel said Clark had mentioned feeling like he was being followed since leaving the western woods, but had ignored Samuel's advice to stay at the mill until morning, to travel with another caravan for safety. The last time the Whitaker family saw him, Clark was walking back toward the main road, determined to reach Lancaster despite the gathering dusk and the rising river fog. Samuel's account was confirmed by his entire family with precise detail, each member providing identical descriptions of Clark's visit. They remembered his fatigue, his dismissal of their warnings, even his curt words as he refused their hospitality. Hannah recalled that the trapper had complained of a headache and had accepted some of her herbal tea for alertness. Before leaving, Ezra had offered to help Clark fix a wheel that seemed wobbly, but the trapper had declined, stating he needed to get to Lancaster quickly. With his delivery, their consistency should have reassured Sheriff Reed. Instead, it struck him as unnervingly perfect, like a play that had been carefully rehearsed and practiced until every detail was memorized. In Reed's experience, honest storytellers always had minor contradictions. While agreeing on the main points, the Whitaker's story was too polished, too complete, and utterly devoid of the small, messy details that mark a genuine account. The sheriff's suspicion deepened when he noticed significant changes on the mill property since he had last passed by. A few months earlier, a new section of wooden flooring had been laid in the main living area of their house, looking sturdier and much newer than the rest. Freshly dug earth was piled near the riverbank, as if a large-scale excavation project had just taken place. Strangest of all, the mill's cellar, typically used for storing grain, appeared to have been significantly expanded. Reed could see new oak support beams around an entrance that now looked large enough for a big man to pass through easily. When Reed inquired about these changes, Samuel explained that the mill had been operating at full capacity, and they were expanding to meet the growing demand from Philadelphia. The new flooring was to reinforce it for heavy flour sacks, and the cellar was being deepened to store more grain for the winter. The explanations sounded plausible and were presented with confidence, but something in Samuel's eyes suggested he was choosing his words with unusual care. Most unsettling was that the family's usual warmth seemed forced. During Reed's visit, their renowned hospitality had an undercurrent of tension that the sheriff could not ignore. Hannah's hand trembled slightly as she offered tea, and Esther repeatedly glanced at her father as if seeking approval for every word she spoke. Even Ezra and Levi, the usually confident and outgoing young men, seemed quiet and wary in ways that suggested they were hiding something important, but with no concrete evidence of wrongdoing. There was little Sheriff Reed could legally do. Clark's case was officially recorded as a mysterious disappearance, likely a victim of highwaymen. His name was added to the growing list of unsolved incidents. Along the colonial roads, the trapper's wagon was sold at auction, and within a month, Benjamin Clark existed only in the memories of those who had known him. However, Clark's disappearance was only the beginning of a pattern that would sow terror on the Schuylkill Road in the months to come, turning a prosperous trade route into a place where travelers whispered warnings and families dared not travel after dark. Throughout the autumn of 1708 and into the winter, the disappearances continued with frightening regularity, defying all logical explanation. Every 2 to 3 weeks, another traveler would vanish without a trace along the same stretch of road, creating a zone of fear around the Whitaker Mill. The victims were diverse in age, wealth, and traveling circumstances. Lone merchants like Clark, small family groups migrating, even armed couriers. What connected them was their complete disappearance, and the fact that each had been known to have stopped or asked for directions at the Whitaker Mill before vanishing without a trace. A German jeweler named Albert Schmidt disappeared in November on his journey from New York to open a shop in Philadelphia. The 50-year-old man was carrying his entire fortune in the form of exquisite crafting tools and a small amount of gold and silver worth hundreds of pounds, an investment that represented years of hard work. His horse was found wandering near the Schuylkill River, his personal belongings scattered but seemingly untouched. The local authorities assumed Schmidt had unfortunately been thrown from his horse, fallen into the river, and drowned. The explanation seemed plausible until it was discovered that his toolbox was missing. From the scene, the oak box, containing finely crafted engraving tools, would have been priceless to any artisan. No common thief would have taken such items, while leaving behind money and other valuables. The Dubois family, a French Huguenot family, disappeared in December during a heavy snowstorm. Pierre Dubois, his wife, Isabelle, and their 2 young children had sought shelter when their wagon became mired in mud, just a few hundred yards from the Whitaker mill. According to Samuel's later account, the Dubois family never reached his mill, despite the short distance, likely getting lost in the blizzard and succumbing to exposure in the dense woods. Their bodies were never found, despite extensive searches. Once the weather cleared, what made the Dubois family's disappearance particularly disturbing was the discovery of their wagon. A week later, the vehicle had been pulled out of the mud and left by the side of the road, cleaned of mud and seemingly thoroughly searched. The family's clothing and personal belongings were gone, but their food and household supplies remained intact. Most puzzlingly, the footprints around the wagon indicated that several people had worked together to free it from the mud, an act that would have required significant time and effort. In the treacherous weather, January brought the disappearance of Reverend Silas Croft, a Quaker missionary who was carrying donations for a new meeting house in Lancaster. Croft was known throughout the region for his benevolence and his fearless travels through even the most remote areas. The 60-year-old Reverend had overcome countless hardships in his 20 years of ministry, making his disappearance particularly shocking to the communities that had considered him a man protected by God. Croft's horse was found 3 days after he vanished, still carrying saddlebags containing a significant sum of donation money. The presence of the money ruled out robbery as a motive, but raised disturbing questions about what kind of threat could have subdued such a respected and well-loved man. Local authorities eventually concluded that Croft had likely lost his way in the fog, fallen from his horse, and died somewhere in the dense woods along the Schuylkill River. Each disappearance followed an inexplicable pattern: abandoned horses found grazing freely or tied to a tree, personal belongings scattered in a way that suggested sudden violence or a struggle, and a clear trail leading toward the Whitaker mill before vanishing completely. Yet, whenever questioned by the increasingly suspicious Sheriff Reed, the Whitaker family offered plausible explanations that could not be disproven. They had seen some of the travelers, yes, but only briefly, and often from a distance. Each victim had been warned about various dangers, bad weather, lurking bandits, but had chosen to continue their journey against the family's concerned advice. In some cases, the Whitakers had offered food and shelter, but had been politely refused by the travelers, who seemed determined to maintain their schedules, regardless of the risks. Sheriff Reed found himself trapped in an impossible situation, growing more frustrated with each new disappearance. The Whitaker family was one of Philadelphia's most respected families. Their reputation for hard work and Quaker piety was beyond reproach. Samuel's sermons at the meeting house continued to draw large crowds. His simple and sincere interpretation of the scriptures impressed even the most esteemed Quaker leaders. Hannah's cooking and healing skills had helped many families through harsh winters, earning her a reputation as a benevolent and trustworthy woman. To accuse such pillars of the community without irrefutable evidence would be a reckless act, one that could ruin Reed's career. and lead to his social ostracism. Reed had seen what happened to officials who dared to challenge the influential. They found themselves isolated, removed from their posts, and sometimes facing slanderous accusations. Philadelphia, though civilized, still operated on a complex network of family and business ties, and attacking the wrong family could ruin a man's life more effectively than any legal proceeding. Furthermore, the family's explanations, though always convenient, were entirely believable. In the colonial context, the Schuylkill Road was genuinely dangerous, with lurking bandits, unpredictable weather, and countless natural hazards that could claim a life at any moment. Dozens of travelers disappeared each year under far less mysterious circumstances than those surrounding the Whitaker Mill. What made this cluster of disappearances statistically distinct was the sheer number of people, in a short period, all last seen near the same location. But statistics mean little in a world where evidence was everything, and the evidence seemed to evaporate like mist on the river. Whenever investigators approached the Whitaker property, the family welcomed interrogations, answered questions with an air of openness and sincerity, and even offered to help in searches along the riverbank. Their cooperation was so perfect and enthusiastic that it almost felt like a mockery of the increasingly frustrated sheriff. The first crack in the family's carefully maintained facade came from an unlikely source. A 10-year-old fisherman's boy named Finn O'Malley, Don, whose family lived in a small cabin downriver from the Whitaker Mill, about a mile away, came to Sheriff Reed in February 1709 with a story that at first seemed to be the product of a child's imagination. The boy recounted that on cold winter nights, when he was out setting eel traps, he had heard strange sounds coming from the direction of the Whitaker Mill. But these were not the normal sounds of a working mill. He heard muffled screams, as if from someone in sheer terror, but they were quickly silenced. These screams were often drowned out by the roar of the massive water wheel, but in moments of quiet wind, they echoed eerily. According to Finn, he had heard such sounds at least 4 times throughout the winter, always in the dead of night. When the rest of the town was asleep, the scream would last only for a few seconds, followed by a loud, heavy thud, as if something massive had fallen, and then the water wheel would resume its steady turning. The sounds always ended abruptly, followed by the silence of the night, leaving Finn to wonder if he had imagined the whole thing. When Reed questioned the boy's father, a cooper, he admitted to hearing strange noises from the mill at night, but had dismissed them as the normal sounds of an industrial operation. Perhaps it was machinery malfunctioning or wood breaking under the weight of the grinding stones. After all, the Whitakers were respectable Quakers who had never given any cause for suspicion. What possible explanation could there be for screams in the night coming from such a hard-working and pious family? Finn's account might have been dismissed as childish fantasy or misunderstood machine sounds, except for one detail that gave Sheriff Reed considerable pause. When questioned further, the boy was able to describe the approximate nights he had heard the screams, and each night corresponded exactly with the estimated time a traveler had gone missing. The correlation was too precise to be a coincidence, too consistent to be explained by chance. Armed with the disturbing testimony of young Finn O'Malley, Sheriff Reed began to build a case against the Whitaker family with the methodical patience of a man who understood that accusations against such a reputable family would require absolutely undeniable proof. He started by quietly interviewing others who lived and worked along the river near the mill, asking carefully chosen questions so as not to reveal his growing suspicions or alert the Whitakers to his investigation. What emerged from these discreet inquiries was a disturbing pattern of small inconsistencies and unexplained phenomena, things that had been overlooked, dismissed, or rationalized by people who trusted the family's reputation more than their own observations. Each piece of evidence was small when considered alone, but together they painted a picture that made Reed's blood run cold. Elias Vance, an old ferryman whose landing was near the mill, recalled several nights when he had seen unusual activity at their property, lanterns moving near the riverbank, at hours when all decent folk should be asleep, and sometimes he heard the sound of heavy objects being dragged across the mill's wooden floors, seeming to continue until dawn. When he mentioned these observations to Samuel Whitaker one morning, the mill owner had offered a plausible explanation. They often had to mill flour at night to meet early morning deliveries for Philadelphia's bakeries, and the noise was just the sound of flour sacks being moved. The explanation had satisfied Elias at the time, but in hindsight, he realized that these nighttime activities seemed disproportionate to the amount of flour a family mill could produce. Furthermore, he had never seen them load large quantities of excavated earth onto any boat, despite rumors they were expanding their cellar. When pressed by Reed for more details, Elias admitted that sometimes, mixed in with the sounds of machinery, he seemed to hear abruptly cut-off screams and cries of pain, muffled by the roar of the water wheel. An old fisherman named Silas Blackwood, who often cast his nets near the mill, reported even more disturbing findings. Blackwood, who had an intimate knowledge of the river and every creature living in it, had discovered strange objects caught in his nets, not the usual logs or debris, but torn pieces of cloth, strange buttons, and sometimes small bone fragments that had been crushed and worn down by the current. Most disturbingly, some of the bone fragments, though tiny, did not seem to be from fish or animals. They were strangely clean, as if they had been boiled, and had sharp, straight cuts that suggested tool work rather than natural decomposition or animal gnawing. When Blackwood approached Samuel Whitaker about these strange findings, the mill owner offered an explanation that seemed plausible, yet not entirely satisfactory. He suggested they were likely refuse from upstream settlements, or perhaps the remains of diseased animals that other families had thrown into the river for disposal. The strong current of the Schuylkill could carry anything, but Blackwood's experienced eye noted details that contradicted this innocent explanation. The fragments always seemed to appear in the same stretch of the river, just downstream from the mill's water outlet. Furthermore, many in the Quaker community had reported significant changes in the Whitaker family's behavior and attitude over the past year. The children, once open and friendly youths, had become withdrawn and quiet, avoiding social gatherings and speaking only when directly addressed. Ezra and Levi, who had previously been very sociable, now seemed tense and distracted during meetings, as if constantly haunted by private worries. The transformation of Esther Whitaker was particularly striking. The young woman, once admired for her angelic voice and radiant smile, now looked gaunt and pale, her face bearing a vague expression of fear that made people uncomfortable. She had stopped singing in meetings altogether, and when she appeared in public, she seemed to avoid eye contact, as if afraid of revealing some terrible secret. Even Samuel's talks at the meeting house had taken on a darker tone in recent months, focusing obsessively on themes of God's judgment, the corruption of the material world, and the need to purge the soul of sin. Where his words once emphasized inner peace and benevolence, they now focused almost entirely on punishment and retribution. Some of the older members of the community had privately expressed concern about the growing harshness of his interpretations. Sheriff Reed also discovered disturbing holes in the Whitaker family's background story, which raised serious questions about their true identity and origins. While they claimed to be survivors of a wildfire in Virginia, no one could verify their previous residence or confirm the specific fire that supposedly drove them to Philadelphia. Reed's inquiries with authorities in Virginia found no records of a Whitaker family owning a mill affected by fire during the time they claimed. Furthermore, the family's arrival in Philadelphia seemed to mark the beginning of their recorded existence, as if the Whitakers had materialized out of thin air. In 1701, they had no correspondence from relatives, no business records from their previous life, no personal belongings that predated their appearance in Philadelphia. For a family that claimed to have lost everything in a fire, they had arrived with significant financial resources and the ability to build an impressive mill. The sheriff's investigation received an unexpected and alarming boost. In March 1709, when a traveling merchant named Gideon Finch arrived in Philadelphia with information that turned suspicion into near certainty. Finch was a well-known figure along the colonial routes, a man whose business required him to travel constantly between cities and who possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of events and figures throughout the region. Finch had spent the previous winter near the Roanoke settlement in North Carolina, where he had heard disturbing stories of a series of disappearances that had plagued the Riverside region. From 1,695 to 1,700, according to local accounts, at least 20 travelers had vanished along a remote stretch of road near a prosperous inn run by a family named Davenport. Josiah Davenport, his wife, Abigail, and their 3 adult children. The similarities between the North Carolina disappearances and the current cases in Philadelphia were too striking to be a coincidence. The pattern was identical. Travelers would be seen heading toward the Davenport family's inn and would then disappear, leaving behind only abandoned wagons and looted luggage. Local authorities had suspected the family, but had never been able to prove their involvement, hampered by the same lack of physical evidence. That was frustrating Reed's current investigation. Even more chilling were Finch's descriptions of the Davenport family themselves. Josiah was a respected innkeeper, known for his piety and hospitality. Meanwhile, Abigail was praised throughout the region for her delicious food and her knowledge of herbs. They had arrived in the Roanoke area, claiming to be survivors of a plague in Maryland, with no verifiable history before their sudden appearance. The family was known for their hospitality to travelers and had built a reputation as respectable members of the community. When Finch described the physical appearance of the Davenport family, Sheriff Reed felt his blood run cold. Josiah Davenport was a large, imposing man with salt and pepper hair and sharp eyes. Abigail was small and quick, with skillful hands and an extensive knowledge of herbs. Their children were the same age and had descriptions so identical to Ezra, Levi, and Esther Whitaker that they could have been the same people. Most damning of all, the Davenport family had disappeared overnight in the spring of 1701, abandoning their inn and vanishing without explanation, just as suspicion about the disappearances began to focus on their property. Neighbors had found the property deserted, with signs of a hasty departure and deliberate destruction. The inn had been partially burned, the well had been filled with rocks and debris, and the entire property showed evidence of a systematic removal of anything that might provide clues to the family's true identity or activities. When North Carolina authorities finally obtained a warrant to search the abandoned Davenport property, they made discoveries that still haunted the investigators involved. Hidden in the woods behind the inn were several shallow graves containing the remains of both animals, And humans, the human remains, included personal items belonging to several of the missing travelers, providing undeniable proof that the Davenport family had been responsible for multiple murders. But by then, the killers had completely vanished, leaving behind only their crimes and the mystery of their true identity. A months-long manhunt found no trace of the Davenport family, and the case was eventually closed with the assumption that they had died in the swamps or had fled to another colony. The implications of Finch's revelation were staggering and horrific. If his account was accurate, the Whitaker family were not just local criminals who had committed a few opportunistic murders. They were experienced serial killers who had perfected their methods over years of practice, moving from region to region when suspicion grew too strong and leaving a trail of death that spanned multiple colonies. Even worse, their current operation in Philadelphia appeared to be far more sophisticated and successful than their previous activities. In North Carolina, they had learned from their mistakes, developed better methods for disposing of evidence, and created a more convincing cover identity that had allowed them to operate undetected for nearly 8 years. The number of victims in Philadelphia could far exceed the number in North Carolina, representing one of the largest killing sprees in the criminal history of the American colonies. The weight of Gideon Finch's testimony settled on Sheriff Reed like a physical burden, but he knew that no matter how compelling the evidence, it would not be enough to convict the Whitaker family. In a court of law, colonial justice moved cautiously, and judges demanded solid physical proof before allowing arrests that could ruin the lives of innocent people and tear apart communities built on trust. The sheriff needed evidence that could stand up to the scrutiny of stern judges and a skeptical jury, evidence that could not be explained away or dismissed as coincidence. The breakthrough he desperately needed came from the source he least expected, from Esther Whitaker herself. On the night of the 18th of November, 1708, the 21-year-old woman appeared at Reed's office like a phantom, emerging from the night fog, her face streaked with tears, her hands trembling with an almost uncontrollable terror. What she told him over the next 3 hours would finally expose the full horror of what had been happening at the Whitaker mill and provide the evidence needed to bring Philadelphia's most notorious murderous family to justice. According to Esther's horrifying confession, her family had been systematically murdering travelers for over 7 years, starting just a few months after their arrival in Philadelphia. But what made her testimony truly horrifying was not just the scale of their crimes, but the methodical, almost ritualistic way the murders were planned and executed. The killing operation, as Esther described it, was far more sophisticated than Reed could have imagined. Her father, Samuel, had convinced the family that they were doing God's work by cleansing the world of what he called the sinful souls. Traveling the Schuylkill Road, the murders were not random acts of violence, driven by greed or opportunity, but carefully planned executions that served both what Samuel claimed was divine justice and the family's increasingly complex material needs. The process began with what the family called the assessment. When potential targets approached the mill, travelers with valuable goods, carrying significant amounts of money, or possessing skills the family coveted, Samuel would engage them in seemingly innocent conversation designed to assess the purity of their souls. He would inquire about their reasons for travel, their business dealings, and their religious beliefs, all while presenting himself as a benevolent Quaker mill owner concerned for their safety. Based on these conversations, Samuel would decide whether each traveler was worthy of what he called purification The wealthy were automatically deemed guilty of greed and attachment to worldly possessions. The educated were condemned for their pride and intellectual arrogance. Families traveling with young children were accused of bringing innocent souls into a world full of temptation. Even preachers of other denominations could be found guilty of spreading falsehoods, marking them as heretics who needed to be saved from their errors. Once Samuel had made his secret judgment, the family would act with the precision of a well-oiled machine. They would invite the condemned travelers to stay overnight, citing concerns for their safety on the dangerous road, or offering to help with wagon repairs or horse care. The family's reputation for hospitality made such invitations almost impossible to refuse, especially during bad weather or when travelers were genuinely in need of assistance. The unfortunate guests would be welcomed into the main house and treated to a lavish meal. Hannah would prepare delicious dishes that showcased her culinary skills, while the children would entertain the guests with stories, music, and displays of their refinement. The evening would conclude with a quiet moment of Quaker-style prayer led by Samuel, whose deep voice and pious demeanor impressed even the most skeptical guests. But in the fragrant rye bread, there was always a secret ingredient, a carefully calculated dose of amanita mushroom powder that Hannah had perfected over years of experimentation. This poison, when mixed with bread and honey, was almost undetectable, producing effects that mimicked natural exhaustion. After a long day of travel, the victims would gradually become drowsy and disoriented, easily accepting the family's suggestion that they should retire early to regain their strength. For the next day's journey, the drugged travelers would awaken to find themselves bound and helpless in the mill's cellars, a complex network of chambers and tunnels dug deep into the underlying granite bedrock. According to Esther's horrifying description, the underground complex stretched for more than 300 meters from the mill out to the riverbank, with multiple levels connected by slippery stone steps and wooden ladders. The largest chamber served as what Samuel called his judgment room, a grotesque parody of legal proceedings, complete with a makeshift dais built from wooden barrels, iron manacles bolted to the stone walls, and simple Quaker religious symbols twisted into instruments of terror. Here, Samuel would preside over sham trials that determined the final fate of each prisoner, presenting evidence of their worldly sins and delivering preordained sentences. But the trials were not merely cruel theater. They served a practical purpose in the family's twisted psychology by framing the murders as acts of purification rather than simple crimes. Samuel created a belief system that allowed his family to commit heinous acts while maintaining a self-image as pious Quakers. Each murder became a sacred mission, each victim a lost soul who needed to be freed from their worldly burdens. The sentences handed down in Samuel's underground judgment room varied according to his assessment of each victim's guilt and the family's current needs. Some prisoners were kept alive for weeks or even months, forced to use their skills for the family's benefit before being executed. The jeweler, Albert Schmidt, was forced to train Ezra in basic crafting techniques before his death. Reverend Silas Croft was made to write meditations on humility that Samuel later used in his own talks, enhancing his reputation as a man of deep wisdom. Others faced immediate execution, often by methods Samuel considered symbolic. Drowning in a subterranean cistern was the fate reserved for those guilty of pride or blasphemy, but the most brutal execution was reserved for those Samuel deemed most wicked, wealthy merchants educated men, and anyone who showed skepticism about faith, they were crushed beneath the giant millstone. Esther's testimony revealed the systematic nature of the family's crimes in terrifying detail. Each member had been assigned specific roles in both the murders and the elaborate cover-up that followed. Ezra and Levi served as the muscle of the operation, responsible for capturing victims through trapdoors, maintaining the underground complex, and disposing of bodies through the underground culvert that led to the river. Their size and strength made them ideal for the physical demands of moving prisoners and heavy stones. Esther herself had been forced to be the family's record keeper, maintaining detailed ledgers that documented the identity, possessions, and method of disposal for each victim. Her careful handwriting filled multiple notebooks with information that read like a merchant's inventory, except the goods listed were human lives, and the transactions were murders. Each entry included the victim's name, age, physical appearance, estimated wealth, and personal effects, along with notes on their last words and behavior during their captivity. Hannah's role was perhaps the most crucial to the operation's success. In addition to preparing the poisoned bread that incapacitated the victims, she was the family's caregiver, keeping prisoners alive when their skills were needed, and ensuring that the executions proceeded without complications that might create evidence. Her knowledge of herbs and the human body, acquired through years of helping the community, had been twisted into an expertise in torture and murder. Most chillingly, Hannah had developed what she called cures for prisoners who proved uncooperative or tried to escape. These punishments were designed to break the will without causing death, using techniques that combined her herbal knowledge with psychological torment. Prisoners who refused to comply with the family's demands would be given calculated doses of pain-inducing and hallucinogenic teas until they became completely submissive. The family's success in avoiding detection depended not just on careful planning. It required an elaborate system of disposal and deception to eliminate all evidence of their crimes. The bodies were never buried on the mill property. Instead, after being crushed or drowned, they were passed through the secret underground culvert and released into the Schuylkill River. The strong current of the river would carry the bodies far away, making detection nearly impossible. Personal belongings were sorted with the efficiency of experienced merchants. Items of monetary value, jewelry, fine weapons, and tools were either kept by the family or sold in distant markets, like New York or Baltimore, where they could not be traced to the missing persons. Less valuable items were carefully scattered along roads in the region, creating false trails that suggested common robberies. Even the victim's clothing was systematically processed, with useful garments kept for the family's use, while distinctive items were burned in the bake oven to prevent identification. Horses posed a particular challenge because they were both valuable and easily recognizable. The family had developed relationships with unscrupulous horse traders in neighboring colonies who asked no questions about the animals' origins by selling the horses far from where their owners disappeared. The Whitakers created more false trails that further confused investigations, but perhaps the most ingenious aspect of their deception was the way they used their reputation in the Quaker community to deflect suspicion. Every act of kindness, every bit of help from Hannah, every sermon by Samuel served a dual purpose. They genuinely helped the community while creating a reputation that made the family almost impossible to suspect. Who would believe that people who lived by the peaceful principles of Quakerism could be responsible for systematic murder? The family had even developed contingency plans for different types of investigations. If the authorities became too suspicious, they would temporarily halt their killing activities while increasing their charitable works. To reinforce their reputation, they had identified several escape routes that would allow them to quickly abandon the mill if discovery seemed imminent, just as they had done when they left North Carolina years before. According to Esther, the family had been planning to expand their operations significantly. They had identified several other remote inns and mills along trade routes where similar purification activities could be conducted, creating a network of killing sites that would allow them to operate with even greater impunity. The ultimate goal was to establish what Samuel called centers of divine justice throughout the colonies, eliminating sinful souls on a scale that would reshape the moral order of the new world. But what finally pushed Esther to confess was not a moral awakening or a sudden pang of conscience. It was terror for her own life. She revealed that Samuel had grown increasingly paranoid about the possibility of being discovered and had begun to see anyone who might pose a threat as worthy of purification. That list now included several neighbors who had asked too many questions. Gideon Finch, the merchant who had been making inquiries about the North Carolina disappearances, and even Sheriff Reed himself. Even more frighteningly, Esther revealed that another victim was currently being held in the cellars, a Dutch cartographer named Willem de Vries, who had been captured 3 days earlier and was scheduled to be judged the following night. But de Vries was not the only prisoner in the family's custody. Unbeknownst to anyone outside, they were also holding 2 other captives, a young woman named Sarah Monroe, who had been missing for over a week, and an older man identified as Captain James McGregor, a sea merchant who had vanished the previous month. The revelation that multiple victims were being held simultaneously showed how confident the family had become in their methods and how dramatically they had escalated their activities. What began as opportunistic murders of isolated travelers had evolved into something resembling an industrial killing operation, with prisoners being held, sorted, and executed on a complex schedule that treated human life as raw material for the family's twisted purposes. Reed realized that the time for careful investigation and legal procedure was over. If Esther's information was accurate, innocent people would die within hours unless immediate action was taken. But he also knew that a direct confrontation with the Whitaker family would be extremely dangerous. They were armed, prepared for resistance, and operating from a fortified position. The stone mill itself, a position they had spent years perfecting for this very type of situation. Sheriff Reed faced the most difficult decision of his career, knowing that every option carried deadly consequences. He could attempt to raid the mill alone, risking not only his own life, but also potentially alerting them to escape before the current victims could be rescued, or he could send for reinforcements from neighboring towns, almost certainly condemning de Vries, Monroe, and McGregor to death while giving the Whitakers time to destroy evidence and flee to another colony where they could continue their killing spree. The choice became easier when Reed realized he would not have to act alone. Nathaniel Stone, whose suspicions had been growing for months, volunteered immediately when approached for assistance. His militia experience and intimate knowledge of the riverside terrain made him an invaluable ally for an assault. Gideon Finch also volunteered his services, driven by a sense of guilt for not exposing the Davenport family's crimes in North Carolina. Years earlier, the merchant's knowledge of the family's past methods and his experience with frontier violence would be crucial in anticipating their likely responses to an attack. 2 other men from the local militia, Elias Vance, the grizzled old ferryman, and Silas Blackwood, the fisherman with a grudge, completed the hastily assembled rescue party. The plan they devised was necessarily simple, but extremely dangerous. The group would approach the mill after midnight, on the 20th of November, using the cover of darkness and surprise to overcome the family's defensive advantages. Their primary goal was to rescue the captive victims, with the capture of the killers a secondary consideration. If the Whitakers could not be taken alive, the rescuers were prepared to use whatever force was necessary to prevent their escape. Esther had provided crucial intelligence on the mill's layout and the family's likely defensive positions. The underground complex had only two known entrances, the main one through the grain cellar and a hidden escape route, the culvert that led directly to the Schuylkill River. The family kept weapons at both locations, and Samuel had trained his sons in defensive tactics designed to hold off attackers long enough for the family to escape via the river. Approaching the mill required a silent boat trip along the riverbank, which would leave the rescuers completely exposed. If detected, Elias Vance's boating skills proved invaluable in identifying a route that used riverside thickets and shadows. For maximum concealment, the group moved with the silence of ghosts on the water, each man understanding that being discovered could mean death for both themselves and the prisoners they were trying to save. What they discovered upon approaching the Whitaker mill exceeded their worst expectations and confirmed that Esther's testimony had actually understated the scale of her family's crimes. The mill showed clear evidence of nighttime activity, far beyond what any normal milling operation would require. A foul, musty odor of decay hung in the air, like a physical presence, overpowering the smell of grain and flour. The main house looked normal from the outside, with a warm light glowing from the windows and smoke rising from the chimney. But as the rescuers drew closer, they could hear sounds that made their blood run cold. Muffled voices coming from beneath the ground, occasional cries, muffled by the roar of the water wheel and the rhythmic clanging of metal on rock that suggested construction was still underway. In the cellars, the rescue operation began at exactly 2 a.m. when the raiders believed the family would be at their least vigilant and most vulnerable to a surprise attack. Reed and Stone approached the main entrance to the underground complex, while Blackwood and Vance took up positions to block the river escape. Finch remained with the muskets, ready to provide cover fire if the operation went wrong. The grain cellar entrance proved far more complex than Esther's description had suggested. What looked from the surface like a simple storage facility was in fact a sophisticated fortification with multiple defensive positions and hidden loopholes. The Whitaker family had spent years preparing for this exact type of assault, creating kill zones that would allow a few defenders to hold off a much larger attacking force. But the raiders' greatest advantage was complete surprise. The family had grown complacent after years of successful operation, never imagining that their respectable Quaker cover could be pierced by the local sheriff. When Reed and Stone stormed the underground complex, they found Samuel and his sons completely unprepared for resistance, instead focused on the grisly work of preparing their current victims for judgment. The rescue of the prisoners was both easier and more horrifying than the raiders had anticipated. They found Willem de Vries chained in a damp stone cell, weakened after days without adequate food, but still alive and conscious. Sarah Monroe was in worse condition, showing signs of the cures that Hannah had used to break her resistance. Captain McGregor was unconscious, his health having failed after weeks of captivity and psychological torture. But the prisoners were not the only ones in the underground complex. As the raiders moved deeper into the warren of tunnels, they discovered evidence of the family's crimes that defied human comprehension. The granite caverns contained a gruesome collection spanning nearly a decade of systematic murder. Bones, fragments of clothing, and personal belongings littered multiple chambers, creating an archaeological record of brutality that would take weeks to fully catalogue. The physical evidence was overwhelming in both its scale and detail. In addition to the human remains, the raiders found the detailed ledgers that Esther had described, written in her careful hand and organized with the precision of an accountant's books. The ledgers contained the names, descriptions, and final possessions of 38 victims, stretching back nearly 8 years, far more than Reed had ever suspected, and representing one of the largest killing sprees in colonial criminal history. But perhaps the most damning evidence was discovered in what Samuel called his judgment room. The underground chamber contained not only the makeshift pulpit and perverted religious symbols, but also a morbid sin collection, small glass vials containing hair, fingernails, and blood from the victims, kept by Samuel as proof of purification. The capture of the Whitaker family was swift but violent, as Samuel and his sons tried to fight their way out of the underground complex rather than face the justice they had denied their victims. The mill owner showed no surprise at being discovered, instead launching into a rambling sermon about God's judgment and the righteousness of his mission. Even as gunfire echoed through the stone cellars, Ezra and Levi fought with the desperate ferocity of men who knew they faced certain death if captured, using their intimate knowledge of the tunnels to launch attacks from concealed positions. The battle raged through multiple chambers for nearly an hour, with the raiders forced to advance carefully through passages the defenders had prepared as kill zones. The end came when Samuel and Ezra were cornered at the river culvert and killed in the confrontation. Hannah, trapped in the main house above, took her own life with the same poisonous fungi she had used on her victims. Levi was captured while trying to escape. Only Esther surrendered voluntarily, her confession having doomed her family and sealed their fate. She was found in her room, sitting motionless, seemingly resigned to whatever judgment awaited her. Her cooperation with the investigation was driven not by a moral awakening, but by the terror that her father's fanaticism would eventually mark her for purification, along with the family's other perceived enemies. The aftermath of the Whitaker family's capture sent shockwaves throughout Philadelphia and the neighboring colonies, forcing communities to confront the horrific reality that one of their most respected Quaker families had been systematically murdering people for nearly a decade. The evidence recovered from the underground complex was so overwhelming and disturbing that city authorities struggled to process the full scale of the crimes. The investigation following the raid revealed details that surpassed even the raiders' worst expectations. The tunnel system beneath the Whitaker mill was far more extensive than anyone had imagined, stretching for nearly 300 meters through natural granite caverns that the family had modified for their murderous purposes. Many of the chambers had been dug out and reinforced, creating an underground complex that could hold dozens of prisoners at once. The physical evidence recovered from these chambers painted a picture of systematic murder that stretched back not just the nearly 8 years the family had lived in Philadelphia, but likely to years of similar crimes in other colonies. In addition to the 38 victims documented in Esther's careful ledgers, searchers found personal items and human remains, suggesting the actual number of murders was significantly higher. Particularly disturbing was the discovery of children's clothing and toys among the recovered evidence, indicating that entire families had been murdered, not just individual travelers. The Dubois family, who had disappeared in the December snowstorm, were discovered to have been held in the underground complex for over a week before being executed. Their children, aged 4 and 7, had been kept alive for several days after their parents' deaths, before being killed, and their bodies released into the river through the culvert. The trial of the remaining members of the Whitaker family began in December 1708 and lasted only a few days, drawing spectators from across Philadelphia and the surrounding regions. The town hall was packed daily with a crowd that included relatives of the victims, curious onlookers, and legal experts who recognized the case as unprecedented in colonial criminal history. The evidence presented was so overwhelming and disturbing that the presiding judge ordered portions of the testimony sealed from the public to prevent widespread panic. Levi Whitaker's behavior during the trial shocked even experienced court observers. Instead of showing remorse for his crimes, he remained defiantly silent, only occasionally repeating his father's words about purification and divine justice. He claimed that every murder was God's will, part of a war against the corruption and materialism that was infesting the New World. According to the family's twisted theology, they had been chosen as instruments of divine judgment, tasked with eliminating lost souls who posed a threat to the moral order of a new society. The money and goods taken from the victims were not theft, but just compensation for their sacred work. The elaborate underground complex was not a prison, but a place for enforcing God's justice. Levi maintained his innocence, despite the overwhelming evidence, claiming that he and his siblings had been forced to participate by Samuel's religious fanaticism and threats. He argued that his mother's knowledge had been used against her will to create the poison and that he had only followed his father's orders out of fear. These claims were contradicted by extensive evidence, showing that all family members had participated willingly and enthusiastically in the murders. Esther's detailed ledgers included notes in different handwritings, indicating that each family member had contributed to documenting their crimes. Personal items found in their rooms, including Samuel's sin collection, suggested that the murders brought psychological satisfaction, not just material gain. Only Esther Whitaker expressed any real remorse for her role in the murders, though her testimony suggested her cooperation with authorities was driven more by fear than a moral awakening. She provided crucial details about the family's methods and helped identify many of the victims through personal items found in the cellars. Her willingness to testify against her family earned her a degree of leniency from the court, though she would still face severe punishment for her involvement in the crimes. The verdicts were delivered swiftly and decisively, reflecting both the severity of the crimes and the community's demand for justice. Levi Whitaker was sentenced to death by hanging, with the execution scheduled for the 15th of December, 1708. The date was chosen deliberately. It marked nearly 2 months since the disappearance of Benjamin Clark had first exposed the family's crimes and initiated the investigation that led to their capture. Esther Whitaker received a sentence of life imprisonment, spared the death penalty, in exchange for her cooperation with the authorities and her youth. At the time many of the crimes were committed, the execution of Levi Whitaker drew a massive crowd to Philadelphia's Central Square, with thousands from across the region coming to witness the end of the city's most notorious, murderous family. The event had a solemn but tense atmosphere, with citizens whispering about the terrible deception that had taken place in their midst. Levi died in silence, his death closing one of the darkest chapters in Philadelphia's criminal history. The Whitaker Mill was completely destroyed shortly after the trial, with every stone torn down in a ritualistic act of community catharsis. The underground tunnels were filled with granite and earth, creating a tomb that ensured the family's victims could finally rest in peace. City authorities declared the land defiled and forbade any future construction on the site. But the legacy of the Whitaker family's crimes extended far beyond their own deaths, setting important precedents in the colonial legal system and fundamentally changing the way communities viewed the balance between trust and security. The case led to new regulations for inspecting inns and public stopovers and established procedures for investigating missing persons that would influence police work for decades. More importantly, the Whitaker case served as a chilling warning about the dangers of blindly trusting reputation and the ease with which evil could hide behind a respectable facade. Communities along the colonial routes began to question their assumptions about neighbors and strangers, recognizing that appearances could conceal the darkest intentions. The legal proceedings also set important precedents for the use of circumstantial evidence and the protection of witnesses who cooperate with the authorities. Esther Whitaker's testimony proved that family loyalty could be overcome by fear, and the right legal protections paving the way for similar prosecutions. In other complex criminal cases, the surviving records of the case were sealed by court order in 1710, with access restricted to officials and legal scholars. This decision was made partly to protect the privacy of the victims' families, but also to prevent the case from inspiring copycat crimes by other twisted individuals. For nearly 2 centuries, the full truth of the Whitaker family remained hidden in those sealed documents, with only fragments of the story surviving in Philadelphia's folklore. The few historians who were granted access to the records had to sign non-disclosure agreements. Even local memory gradually forgot the specific details of the murders, turning the story into vague tales of a haunted mill on the banks of the Schuylkill River. The location of the mill itself became uncertain as the city grew and the landscape changed. The rediscovery of the case files in 1959 finally allowed historians to piece together the complete story of one of America's first serial killing families. But even today, many questions remain unanswered. The tunnel system where the family carried out their crimes was never fully explored, and historians believe that other evidence may still be hidden in the sealed-off passages which were too dangerous for 18th century investigators to access. Modern forensic techniques could potentially reveal much more about the family's crimes, but the sealed caverns would be extremely difficult and expensive to excavate. City authorities have shown little interest in reopening what they consider a historical matter, preferring to let the dead rest rather than risk new revelations that could be traumatic for the descendants of the victims. The Whitaker case also highlights the fragility of newly formed communities, which valued reputation over evidence and trust over vigilance. The family's success depended not just on their own criminal skill, but also on the willingness of their neighbors to overlook uncomfortable evidence in order to maintain social harmony. The price of that willingness was measured in human lives. This mystery shows us that early American justice was often more complex and disturbing than traditional histories have acknowledged. The formation of the colonies created not just opportunities for honest settlers, but also perfect hunting grounds for predators who knew how to exploit the trust and desperation of vulnerable travelers. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed about the Whitaker family's crimes, or could there be even darker secrets still buried beneath the soil of Philadelphia? Could similar families have operated in other colonies without ever being discovered? Leave your comments below and share your theories on this horrifying case. If you enjoyed this story and want more dark history like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with your fellow mystery lovers. We'll see you in the next story.